Good evening, and welcome to this special live broadcast on WBUR in Boston, 26.2 Beyond the Finish Line. I'm Tom Ashbrook. We're coming to you tonight from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, where the last light of this rainy day is still brightening the beautiful Boston skyline behind me. 1 year ago tonight, this city we all love was reeling from the shock of an attack on one of our most treasured local institutions, the Boston Marathon. Patriots' Day, a uniquely Massachusetts tradition if there ever was one, became the date of an assault on the very nation it celebrates. More than that, it felt like, and was, an assault on Boston, on Bostonians, on us. We're gathered here tonight to remember that awful day and to reflect on what it meant to each of us and to all of us together. With us are just a few of the first responders who so bravely leapt into action when the bombs went off, and who, in doing so, undoubtedly saved many lives. We honor them, and we thank them, and we are glad they're here. Yet, we are not here only to talk about April 15th, 2013. We also want to look back on the year since then and look forward to the days and years ahead. What changed in Boston that day, and what didn't? What does it mean to live in Boston now, and who are we as a city because of what we've been through? Our program tonight is a little unusual for WBUR. We often gather to talk together, to discuss the issues of the day with the most interesting people we can find, and we'll be doing that tonight. But for this occasion, we felt it was important, appropriate, to do more than talk. So we'll have several musicians joining us tonight, along with a historian, a poet, and a novelist who will share their reflections with us. It's 40 years since I first came to Boston as a 16-year-old boy, young man. I loved it then, I love it now, as millions do. This is an important day to pause and reflect. So let's begin. The Longwood Symphony Orchestra, a terrific group of musicians who all just happen to have day jobs as healthcare providers, has lent us its music director, Ronald Feldman, tonight. He is not a doctor, but he directs them, and that's an achievement in itself. Mr. Feldman was the youngest musician at age 19 ever selected by the BSO. After a distinguished career there, he came to the Longwood Symphony in 2012. After he plays a wonderful cello piece for us tonight, we'll hear from Jill Lepore, the Harvard professor of American history and author, most recently, of Book of Ages, a biography of Benjamin Franklin's sister Jane of Boston. In her spare time, Jill's spare time, she's a staff writer for The New Yorker, and she'll be reading a piece she wrote for them just after the bombings last year. But first, Ronald Feldman, playing the same music that Yo-Yo Ma played at Ground Zero in tribute to the victims there, the Sarabande movement, from the Suite No. 5 in C minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. For those who died, for those who survived, for those who saved lives, for Boston.
To If by Sorrow. The bombs went off near the finish line at last year's Boston Marathon, took the lives of 3 people, one of them an 8-year-old boy named Martin Richard. Hundreds of people were wounded. That afternoon, CNN offered a count of lost limbs, 10 and climbing. More than 17,000 runners had already crossed the finish line by the time the first bomb exploded. Another 4,500 runners were stopped. The race was called off. Most everything else that day was called off too, partly out of precaution, but mostly owing to heartbreak. The Boston Marathon started in 1897. It's held on Patriots' Day, a Massachusetts state holiday marked by the anniversaries of the battles of Lexington and Concord. Patriots' Day is the kind of holiday that even people who hate holidays love. Runners come from all over the country and all over the world. Their flags fly over the finish line, and many of them are raising money for charities. Schools are closed, and reenactors wearing tri-cornered hats tramp all over the city, their woolen cloaks and cowls billowing as they stride. Patriots' Day used to be the day of the Red Sox home opener, which meant that if you wanted to see both the game and the marathon, you were in a pickle. It's hard to get around the city on Patriots' Day. The subway cars are packed and the streets are so thronged with people that you can't even thread your way through the city on a bicycle. The baseball season, though, has since gotten stretched, and Patriots' Day is now more of a weekend than a day. Last year, the Sunday before the marathon, I went to see the Red Sox play Tampa Bay. It was a glorious game. Clay Buchholz nearly pulled off a no-hitter. But the best thing about it was that the stands were filled with marathoners. They wore their Boston Marathon blue and yellow track jackets, and everyone clapped them on their backs and wished them luck. That night, after the game, I went to Old North Church in Boston's North End. There were marathoners all over the North End, too, eating spaghetti. Old North has been holding a lantern ceremony every April since 1875. It commemorates the night on April 18th, 1775, when the church's sexton risked his life to light 2 lanterns in the belfry. That signal set Paul Revere off on his ride, and in 1860 inspired Henry Wadsworth Longfellow to sound another alarm in a poem he wrote on the eve of the Civil War about how, born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. At Old North's lantern ceremony, a fife and drum band plays 18th century music, and the church's vicar, Stephen Ayres, talks about what the lighting of the lanterns means to his church and to the city and to the country. They're beacons of courage. Last year, Pam Cross, a Boston television news anchor, read Longfellow's poem, and I read a letter written by Jane Franklin to her brother Benjamin about how terrifying it was to hear from Boston that night and all through the morning the shooting in Lexington and Concord. "The distress it has occasioned me is past description," she wrote to him. "Massacre is always beyond the allowance of reason." I didn't go into Boston to watch the marathon last year. I stayed home in Cambridge to prepare for class. I heard about the bombs while walking to a drugstore to buy pens. I was crossing Massachusetts Avenue when the news burst onto my phone, frantic texts about explosions. Head down, heart sinking, I nearly ran into a towering figure in black, a reenactor, Paul Revere on a speckled horse. He was riding to Lexington, a ride become forlorn.
Jill Lepore, thank you for that reading. Jill Lepore. Jill, you are an artist with the essay, and we heard it right there, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
That was 1 year ago. Can we turn you to your historian's role for just a moment as that The artistry, the eulogy in that essay still resonates with us. You wrote there, massacre is always beyond the allowance of reason. That image of a forlorn Paul Revere on that day. It's a year on. First, just emotionally, does it still stand for something forlorn to you, or has that changed, Jill?
One way in which it changes is through memorials like this, which we use to make sense of the passage of time. I mean, I think about that really quite agonizing letter that Jane Franklin writes, knowing about the shots being fired in Lexington, Concord. It's so common to say, what I hear about what I'm learning, what I see is past my description. That in the moment, we are at a loss for words, this sort of universal human experience of the deprivation of language. The world becomes unreal in moments of great tragedy, and especially moments of senseless violence, especially during wars. And it's so interesting what memory does to change that. Not just the writing of history, but what memory does to actually to turn events around, to cast light on some features of something that happened and to move into the darkness other features. I mean, even just think about Paul Revere's Ride, which had very little purchase on the imagination of Americans in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s.
He rode, the horse
It was just, Paul Revere, his obituary was one sentence. He was just some guy.
Yeah.
It's really not until Longfellow in 1860 writes this poem memorializing Paul Revere. Suddenly Paul Revere, has this mythic role because Longfellow animated him into the tragedy of his day, which was the coming of the Civil War, and used the story of this long ago loss to activate people's imaginations for a newer struggle. So there's some other way in which when time passes, the meaning of events changes.
So now we sit just 12 months after the Marathon bombings. I mean, you're an historian. We can't know now, but think with us for a moment here. How will our grandchildren, if they do, think of this day, when hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year, when it's April 15th, 2013? What might be remembered?
The reason historians don't prophesy is that it really depends what comes next. If you picture, this seems like a heartless thing to do, but if you were to picture a data set plotted on an X-Y map where X is time and Y is the incidence of domestic violence, right? And you could start at any point.
And you don't mean in the home, you mean violence in our country. I mean
violence in the United States, and you say started with 9/11 and you move forward, and we have, then there's this passage of time, and then we come to the Boston Marathon, and if we're thinking we could put the London 7/7 bombings there in 2005 as something that people understood these things through. But you could also put on that same plot all the school shootings that have taken place that are terrifying and that work in a kind
Aurora, and Sandy Hook.
Newton, which was just a few months before the Boston Marathon bombings. Then we have this whole set of different data points that are about acts of terrifying, unimaginable violence happening in the United States. And how we understand those historically really has to do with what comes next, which is the pattern that turns out to hold. Are we looking at the end of something, the beginning of something else? Are we looking at a rise in one kind of violence and a diminishment of another? We can't know that from here.
You think it's possible that these two young men, these brothers, might be seen as more in line with shooters in Tucson and Aurora and Columbine and Newtown than in the line of 9/11 and the London bombings and the Madrid bombings? Even after the trips to Dagestan and all the rest?
I think they obviously would be understood as part of the story of the rise of a particular kind of terrorism that has a very particular history. But it intersects, too, with the story of a kind of adolescent American male violence. And so historically, it just sort of depends which way both of those stories end up.
On this night, 1 year after the bombings, we began to open up to the whole range of possibilities. Jill Lepore, you help us do that. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Jill Lepore. Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much. We're coming to you live from the John F. Kennedy Library on this 1 year anniversary of the Marathon bombings. There are so many names that resonate today. Crystal Campbell of Medford, who'd just moved to Arlington and died. Lou Lingzhe, the BU graduate student who had come to Boston to study, who died. Martin Richard, 8 years old. His family from Dorchester, just next door here. And of course, Denise and Bill and Janie and Henry, his family. Just a little less than a year now, I was at the Electricians Union Hall, less than a mile or two from here, with Bostonians, raising money for them and many others in the One Fund. The city responded so fully. Sean Collier, the MIT police officer, killed on that Thursday night. We all remember. My wife works at MIT. She knew Sean. These are real people. Ed Davis, the police commissioner at that time, who spoke so eloquently to and for the city. Daniel Linsky, who was on a stage much like this with us at WBUR just a few nights after the bombing, number 2 on the scene and in Watertown. Jeff Bauman, who we've heard from today, who lost both legs, who ID'd the Tsarnaevs from his hospital bed. Carlos Arredondo, the man in the cowboy hat in that iconic photo of Bauman's rescue. Adrienne Hazlitt Davis, the dancer, lost foot, part of her leg, just did a TED Talk, dancing with a prosthesis. Danny, the man who was carjacked. Tariq Ahmed, who called 911 after that carjacking, a call that put police on the path to capture. So many names flood in to our minds today. Jill mentioned beacons of courage, and we know those. We saw them last year in the faces of people who saw their fellow citizens fall and who ran heedless of their own safety to help. They were running toward the bombs. Those are the words of longtime Boston Globe columnist Kevin Cullen, words he wrote shortly after those 2 terrible explosions. Kevin is with us here tonight, and congratulations, Kevin, to you and everyone at the Globe on this week's Pulitzer Prize. Recognition of all your hard work covering this difficult story, well deserved. Thank you for being here. We've appreciated the joy, but also somber modesty with which the Globe has received this accolade this year. Also with us here on the dais at the John F. Kennedy Library with the fading skyline of Boston behind us tonight, one of the brave men Kevin Cullen wrote about, Boston firefighter Sean O'Brien. Sean was dealing with some boisterous college students and their balcony barbecue on Comm Ave 1 year ago today when he heard the bombs a block away, and he ran toward the bombs to help. Sean, thank you very much for being with us this evening. And with us, too, is Alicia Shambo, a brave woman who also ran toward the bombs. Alicia served 4 years of active duty in the U.S. Navy as a hospital corpsman. She's been a marathon volunteer for years. Last year, she was handing out Mylar blankets at the finish line when everything changed. Alicia, thanks for joining us here tonight. Kevin, take us back just for a minute to everyone remembers how they first got the news and it began to sink in on this day 1 year ago. How did it come to you? How did it begin to sink in? What was going on?
I actually saw it on the television and felt kind of stupid that I wasn't there. And initially it was sort of like, this can't be real, you know, and I thought maybe a transformer or something like that. Yeah. And then when it said there was a second explosion, it reminded me of the 9/11, that, yeah, maybe a plane went off course and hit a building, but 2 of them don't do it.
Yes.
And, you know, like a lot of people, I ran toward the scene and couldn't get close enough, but it was, I thought about it a lot today. It was this, and I think we said something to this effect last year at the time, Tom, that Boston is a very international city, but it's never more international than Marathon Day when we have so many people from
all the runners,
all over
all
the world.
the flags.
From the flags, the town is so alive, and everything about the town for those few days is great. And it's funny, I saw there's a lot of people walking around today. Yes. You can always tell Germans because they have like really weird like colored socks and sneakers I've never seen. I go, they're the Germans. So it's just great what happens when the marathon is, and we kind of lost that. It was just, it felt so personal, the attack. And, you know, when you look back, it was totally impersonal the way it was done. But, and I heard my buddy Sean say this earlier, we are a small, big city. But it's weird because I think it's very hard to go throughout this town and not find somebody who was not directly impacted. I'm not saying I know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody directly impacted by what happened. And the one thing, before I go on, I just want to say that, you know, there's been so much remembrance today, and it's all appropriate. But one guy that I haven't heard his name thrown out there, and we lost a great cop last week. His name is Dennis Simmons. And DJ...
in the Back Bay fire.
Yeah, he suffered, we believe, an aneurysm. We're not really absolutely sure. He was working out at the police academy last week.
Oh, right, yes.
And DJ was one of the cops, the gang unit guys like the guys that were running toward the bombers, and he was actually wounded in the head by one of the bombs, the homemade bombs that the bombers threw at him. And, you know, we don't know yet whether he died as a result of those wounds, but I think you can put two and two together. But the bottom line is we lost another guy to this, as far as I'm concerned. We lost somebody from that event. And DJ will be buried on Thursday after a funeral in Randolph. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to say that his dad, Dennis, his mother, Roxanne, and his sister, Nicole, that we're remembering him today, too.
Dennis Simmons, remembered, right here.
Great guy.
Sean O'Brien, you were on duty that day. Yes. You were over on Comm Ave. You heard the explosion. Did you know immediately that it was a bomb, bombs?
I was actually at the corner of Boylston and Fairfield, so we could see the first bomb go off, and I immediately looked at my watch. And it was 10 of 3, so I knew it wasn't a ceremonial cannon.
No.
And the gentleman that was with me, firefighter Mike Foley, is an Iraq War veteran. He immediately whispered in my ear, he said, "Obi, that's a bomb." So we hopped the fence, and the spectators did us a huge favor that day because they immediately self-evacuated.
Yeah, clear the area.
We didn't have to tell anyone to run. We didn't have to tell anyone to leave. They all left. And as we made our way down to the first bomb site, the second blast went off. And there was some walking wounded, and they took our direction. They went to, there was 2 medical tents, one at Boylston and Hereford and one behind the public library. We were funneling them towards Boylston and Hereford. And then we went to the pile. The second pile, as inappropriate as that may seem, and we just went to work.
Of people, of
Yes.
bodies, of remains. Alicia?
Of neighbors.
Of neighbors for you. I know you
Correct.
knew and know the Richard family
Yes.
very well, and there they were. Alicia, how did it first come to you? What was going on?
I typically work the starting line.
Yeah.
I'm from Hopkinton.
Yeah.
And a couple years ago, a girlfriend of mine asked if I'd like to be involved in the finish line. I said, of course. So even with my medical credentials and Liz being a doctor, we signed up for the Mylar blankets. And so I was working the Mylar blankets that day. We never expected to be called into medical action. When the first bomb went off, because I am a Navy medic and because of my history with the military, I was very familiar, unfortunately, with the sound. So the first bomb went off, and I immediately knew what was taking place very soon after, 10 seconds. The second one went off, and I just tried to immediately clear the area, tried to encourage people to just move as quickly and as, you know, securely as you can out of this area. Don't worry about your belongings, just go. And at that point, I looked at Liz and I said, "I'm going in." And she said, "I'm right behind you." And we just headed for, you know, the bomb scene. And I ran across a police officer and he said, you can't go in there. I said, "I'm a medic. I'm needed in there." And I brushed by him and off I went, and a bit, again, just, you know, began triage as best I could to the first person I came across. And then unfortunately, it was almost like an assembly line because there was just so many victims and there were so many people that needed help that you stabilized one, you got them into the medical tent knowing that the triage crew would take care, get them out of the back of the tent and into an ambulance, and then you went and you found your next patient.
And the next.
And the next.
And the next.
And the next.
Kevin,
Correct.
you know Sean O'Brien's story, that he saw Bill Richard facing him. This has been reported, and yelling, "I can't find Denise." This is, of course, the father and speaking of his wife, and he can't find her, and there's Sean facing his friend in the middle of all this.
I think it's extraordinary what Sean and his colleagues from Engine 7 and Tower Ladder 17 and the guys from 33 and Ladder 15, what they did, because, I mean, Sean can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think almost every guy on 7 knew the Richard family at one level. I mean, Kevin Meeham's the chauffeur. I think Kevin's daughter babysat the kids. And Sean, like I said, I mean, Sean's looking at Martin there. I mean, I don't even think I wrote half of what Sean, I saw Sean the day after the bombings. I went down to Broadway, the fire station, and talked with these guys. And they didn't want their names in the paper.
Yeah. Too soon, too much.
They didn't want any attention on them. They didn't think they did what they're trained to do. They didn't want any, they didn't want to be glory hogs. They're not like that. Those guys aren't like that. But I mean, that's how deeply personal it was for these guys, particularly from Engine 7 and Tower Ladder 17. They knew these people. And yet what I think was so extraordinary, you know, Sean's looking at this kid and knowing this is the kid that was so nice to my daughter,
Yeah,
Ava.
a classmate.
So good to my kid, and I don't even know how he did it. I think it's Herculean. I think it's I don't like the word hero because I think it's marginalized. I think it's used too much.
I agree with that.
But what he did and what those guys from 7 and 17 did was just beyond description. And but more than, they didn't single out the Richards or anybody else. They, you know, there was a firefighter from 7, Benny, who... Benny Upton
True
went
hero. Marine Corps
He's a
sniper.
Marine
Yes,
Corps guy,
yes.
3 tours of duty. Benny, you know, tied off a woman's leg and saved her life. And then I remember he told me, I was sitting with you, Sean, when he told me, there was a homeless guy sitting with his back against the wall. And the guy was just, as I said, his ragged clothes were made more ragged by the bomb. And Benny went right to him and saved his life. So there were no distinctions made. They didn't ask people who they were. They didn't ask what their zip code was. They saved their lives. And I'm still in awe of that. A year later, I'm in awe of what these people did.
Alicia, you bonded with one young woman in bad shape there and ended up going to the hospital with her. How did that connection take place with all the trauma around you?
Well, Tom, like I say, I'd assisted many, many people, and unfortunately, in that situation, you don't get an opportunity to exchange name and numbers.
Right.
And Victoria, she's 20 years old. She's a Northeastern student. She was young. She was beautiful. She was caught by pieces of the bomb in her left leg. And she's surrounded, of course, by people she doesn't know. She's going through a traumatic situation, and she looked at me in the eyes and said, "Please don't leave me." And although I knew there was many more wounded that I wanted to go help, at the same time I thought about my own children, and I thought if they were in a situation like that
vulnerable,
I could not leave her. It was just not an option. Just like running into the tragedy was not an option. So I stayed with her, and I brought her to Tufts Medical Center in the ambulance, and gave the doctors as much information as I could. And I recall, after they wheeled her into the operating room, I had to ask the charge nurse, "Where am I?" Because I didn't even know where I was.
Sean, Kevin wrote, on that day they ran toward the bombs. Everyone's impressed with the immediate response and the complete generosity of the response on that day. But were you surprised by it with your training, with your background, knowing so many of those first responders as you do and did?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. And as Kevin said before, Boston is a big city, but it's a small town. So I did 7 years on Boston EMS, so I know a fair amount of those guys. I'm born and raised in Dorchester. I played ball all my life with many guys who were police officers. That day, walking up Boylston Street, I saw a kid that I played CYO basketball with. I hadn't seen him in 20 years. So I knew, given our 3 disciplines, police, fire, and EMS, I knew that would be all right. I knew if we jumped into the fray and if there was an ancillary, barring another bomb, an ancillary group of bad guys, if you will, that were going to come and get us, trying to help the wounded, that the police had our backs. I also knew that Boston EMS, in my opinion, the best pre-hospital organization on the East Coast, I've never been to the West Coast.
Yeah. Boston strong.
Right. And I've seen what they've done, because I was a part of it, and it's incredible.
Yes.
But what struck me most is, I was at Fairfield and Boylston. I hopped the fence. It may have taken me 45 seconds to get there.
Yeah.
And there were already hands on the most critically wounded people. Already hands. Civilians, firefighters that were on duty, police officers that were on and off duty, helping. So that whole scene was cleared in 18 minutes. 2 massive bomb sites cleared in 18 minutes. And I don't know the raw numbers, but I would argue that the most critical patients that day were prepped in a trauma room, getting ready for surgery within 35 minutes, which is astounding.
You know, Alicia talked about her family and how she thought of them as you looked down at this young woman. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. In Boston, and well beyond, because of all the international attendees you described, Kevin, I mean, we all know that. Who hasn't been out to watch the marathon with their kids right by the race and loved the intimacy of it, loved the crowds along the race, whose family hasn't been vulnerable, if you look at it in these terms sometime. But in this year since, Kevin, I mean, you look around the world, you look at Syria, you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan. It was a terrible day for Boston. But how have you come to look at it? Is it that you wrote on that day, you know, it would be wrong to say we lost our innocence, but there was something about that joy that was innocent that we never imagined would be hit in this way. At the same time, here we are a year later, and you put it in the context of a whole world where people deal with terrible tragedies, and the death toll of that day can be, if we're honest about it, can be made to look small, almost on any given day in a lot of places. Well, so how do we fairly look at our pain, our anger, our city, the suffering that still goes on, but in that context?
A very nice guy from North Cambridge named Tip O'Neill once said that all politics is local, and so is all suffering. And the one thing that's kind of bothered me over the past year, and I've seen, you know, the sort of cynical view of like, hey, at the end of the day, 3 people were killed in the bombing. A police officer named Sean Collier was murdered a few days after, and blah, blah, blah. You know, put it in the context of what's happening in Syria. I don't know how you can even respond to that. I think it's horrible what's happening in Syria, but I don't live there. I live here. And I think about Syrians and worry about Syrians every day when I see those pictures. Yeah. But all I can tell you is what happened in our town. And the reality is, if in other parts of the world, if the good people would respond to any tragedy the way the good people in this town responded, we'd all be a lot better off.
At least you've been in the service. The same question to you. Here's Boston's suffering, and it's real, and we want to hold that innocence and joy of that day, and it deserves protection. It deserves our love and our sorrow when it's broken, as it was for a day last year. When you look at it in the context of the year that's gone by, does it make the days, the pain, the suffering, what happened seem larger, smaller? How's it evolved in your heart and mind over this year?
Tom, in my mind and my heart, I was very angry on Marathon Monday. And being in the military and being in volatile situations, and when you talk about Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, our men and women of the armed forces are over there fighting for our protection as well as others throughout the world. They're there on a mission, and they have certain expectations because of that mission. But when you're on a sunny Monday afternoon in downtown Boston, trying to celebrate a tradition that has gone on for years and years and brought people together from all over the world, you never, ever expect to have something take place like took place last year. And that was evil at its finest. It was just wrong, and I was angry. And I think that's what the people of Boston are feeling right now is anger and determination, because we are strong, we will stand, and we will not falter here.
Sean, has the coming together of this community in the years since, Has it overcome that sense of grievance, wound, anger? I mean, you can look at both of them. The wound and suffering is terrible, and it goes on for many people, and we know it, and you know it personally.
Absolutely.
But there was also something really beautiful that began emerging on that very day, and it's happened in the years since. How do you put those side by side, the beauty and the horror?
Well, I'm a Dorchester kid, born and bred.
Yeah.
The Irish like to fight, but we hate to win. So
Boston strong.
what these young men chose to do, what these cowards chose to do, was to maim and murder women and children. So we took a punch in the gut.
Yes.
But I think in typical Boston fashion, you rally around the flag. I mean, I'm sure everyone here has been to a time, right? Your neighbor's
Sure.
down on your luck, you go to a time.
Yep.
You know, so-and-so has got
Let's
some
pitch
bad
in.
news
Let's
from the
be there.
doctor, so we're having a fundraiser, and that's how we roll in Boston. That's how we do it. So I think, you know, the magnitude of last year and the outpouring of love initially locally and then globally is just, it's part of the human nature. You help your neighbor, whether they like it or not. The bad guys, you help your neighbor. You know what I mean? And we all have pride, and you know you don't want to bother anybody. But when push comes to shove, a friend or a family member needs a hand, you just jump in.
And look what it's done to us culturally. The Yankees are coming to town next week. I so want to write a column making fun of them because they've spent about $80 billion after the Red Sox
Maybe
won the
90.
World Series.
Yeah.
But, you know, when everybody in Yankee Stadium last year got up and sang Sweet Caroline, and I hate Sweet Caroline. I mean, Jesus Christ.
There's a hand up from Sean as
I don't know where
well.
that came from.
I've been trying to get Red Sox fans to stop saying Yankee sucks and say Sweet Caroline sucks, but I'm not getting anywhere there. But that said, to see that kind of reaction, and I've said that to other people, the sort of, you know, what flew into this town in the wake of the bombings was extraordinary, because it was literally from all over the world. And I remember I got a beautiful email from a Kenyan runner. The Kenyans, I don't know if every year they go to Hopkinton.
Of course.
And they go to this third grade class. And
Elmwood School.
And the
Yes.
kids
Hopkinton.
sing to them in Swahili.
That's beautiful.
And it's beautiful. And I mean, but our whole, like I said, I can't make fun of the Yankees anymore. The world is turned upside down.
Unbearable.
Thank God for
Sure you
Aroyd.
can.
Listen, but seriously, this is a city of history. March 5th, 1770, British soldiers killed 5 people in Boston. We call it the Boston Massacre, and the kids still study it. How do you think April 15th, 2013 is likely to sit in this city's sense of itself, in this city's sense of history over time? Alicia?
I know that Northeastern University has put together an archive of different people who were affected by the bombing.
Oral history, and it's beautiful. A lot of it's run on WBUR. It's been just terrific.
Correct. So I'm aware of that, and I think the world is ever vigilant and conscious of 9/11, and I think that the Boston Marathon will follow suit. I think it's something that children need to learn about. I think it's something that we need to never forget, and I think that it's going to continue to be taught in our schools, and it should be a part of our history.
What do you think you'll tell your grandchildren one day, Sean, about that day 1 year ago?
I guess that it was a horrible day in time, brought on by 2 misguided, irresponsible cowards. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't a religious statement. It was just 2 knuckleheads that chose to put bombs at the feet of women and children. And I think what I will tell them is the important part of life is when you get thrown a curveball is to keep on keeping on and pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and like Boston did, and go on about your life.
And it has, and we have.
We have.
Kevin, how do you think it's going to settle into Boston's long history?
It's interesting the way you raised the compared to, just raised that whole idea about the Boston Massacre, because when you think about it, that was a huge point in American history, and yet only 5 died. And I'm reminded it was a brother, Crispus Attucks, and an Irish guy named Patrick Carr, who died side by side. And it took us 200 years for the brothers and the Irish to get along with each other. So there is hope for everything. But also remember that Mr. Adams got the soldiers off.
Yes,
and I hope that doesn't happen in here. I hope that there's justice for everybody. And I also hope that what is remembered from this, it's funny when you think about in the context of the Boston Massacre, the British Empire was so overwhelmingly powerful. And yet, what happened after that and everything that sprung on from that, there was a greater force that could beat an empire. And just as, those bombs that went off a year ago this day were very powerful at the moment. And they killed, they maimed, they wounded both bodies and soul. And yet everything that has followed since that is so much more powerful than a bomb.
Toward community, toward pulling together.
Humanity.
Toward humanity.
So it's meant, when you asked Sean, what will you tell your grand, because I actually wrote this, I think, at one point last year. What will Mr. Tsarnaev tell his kids? What did you do during the war, Daddy? Well, I put a bomb in back of a young boy named Martin Richard, and it killed him. And it killed a beautiful girl from China named Lindsay Liu. And my brother killed a beautiful girl named Crystal Campbell. And then we both killed a police officer named Sean Collar. That's what I did during the war.
Will the joy be back next week? Will it begin to be back next week, Alicia?
It will. It will. It is a tradition in Boston that you can't take away. And the determination that has come out of this tragedy is so strong that there will be joy, there will be closure, and there will be triumph. Absolutely.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say an African's going to win.
Alicia Shambo, Sean O'Brien, Kevin Cullen, thank you very much for being with us here tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sean. Listeners, we're coming to you live. Thank you, Sean. Thank you. Coming to you live from the John F. Kennedy Library. It's grown dark outside now, but it's light inside. I'd like to welcome another wonderful musician to this observance of the first anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. Please welcome the founding guitarist and singer in Buffalo Tom. Tonight he'll be singing for us a song called Best Route. Please welcome Bill Janowitz.
Well, we found the best route on summer's last day. After watching all of our friends slip away, going off to work and school and then never making their way back home again. With the soul of a baby in a beachland hotel, the neon liquor store that we knew too well. We spent the night in the dunes after drinking like fools, waking up to see the kids on the way to school. It was one of those days where it all seems wrong, taking wrong turns, getting lost in a song, driving in the dark with the radio on, to remember them. And when the blasts come, and the blasts will come, just make like a mountain, don't you run. With the right amount of cowardice, you're able to stay. Don't let your summer just slip away. It was one of those days where it all seems wrong, taking wrong turns, getting lost in a song, driving in the dark with the radio on, to remember them. We found the best route on summer's last day. Yeah, we found the best route on summer's last day. Well, we found the best route on summer's last day. 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 Found the best route on summer's last day.
Bill Janovitz of Buffalo Tom. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you very much. Thank you. Making our way back home, riding in the dark with the radio on. We like that at WBUR. Fantastic. We're celebrating, observing, reflecting on the first anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings here at the John F. Kennedy Library. Bill Janovitz of Buffalo Tom, thank you very much for being with us. Next, we're privileged tonight to have with us a national winner of the Poetry Slam competition and a beloved Boston poet. He's also a songwriter, an author, an educator. He's performed with celebrated poets and musicians all over the country. Tonight, here in this hall, he'll be performing a work he wrote especially for our city. It's called, you guessed it, Boston, a reluctant love poem. Please welcome Regie Gibson.
Boston, oh Boston, I dig you, baby. No, I more than dig you, I dig you. Big dig how every night you make the stars and street lamps fight for the right to light you. Big dig you, you bean pot of asphalt, glass, and rubber. That cute little way you have of making both clean hands and dirty work your lovers. How each year you go once more unto the academic breach with your army of educators fighting to teach your hard-headed students. Some of who get groggily foggy every night, working late by dim desk light to scale the menacing heights of your formidable scholastic walls. Boston, I big dig each and every all of your taverns, those towny caverns where both blue and white collar gather to holler out their dreams. You know what I mean? Look out your myriad windows, Bean. Big dig the scene of all those so-and-sos who, like me, fell in love with you so many years ago. Big dig them out there on your corners, freezing to death on your corners. From Mattapan to Wonderland, Jamaica Plain to the Cambridge border. Big dig them out there on your streets, in their cars, getting lost on your streets, if streets are what they really are. I'm starting to believe you when you tell me that these are really paved over cow paths that somehow seem to have some laughable sort of chaotic order. Boston. Girlfriend. Baby, we need to talk. You see, I have noticed lately that as you and I take a walk along the common, you seem to have this inordinately Brahmin-like need for power, the desire to seethe and glower at the human race through a face wet with 17th century sweat. And you really seem to like telling people, no, 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 not you and not yet. And when I first got here, back in the early days, and I wasn't quite used to your wicked, wicked ways, that made me upset. And I still get more than a little bit miffed at the fact that your state house never seems to miss nor lack new ways in which to tax. Or when I try to call you to complain about it, your phone is never on. Or whenever I would want a blue, green, red, and orange line swing to wine and dine and blow off a little steam, your tea trains would refrain at 1 in the morn. 1 in the morn? But then comes the dawn, when your soon-to-be freshly coffeeed head begins its rattle and hum, and I can't stay mad at you for long. Especially when I can feel you stirring next to me, yawning awake by yonder light that breaks out of Eastie, piercing as fiercely as the bleating of bagpipes and the beating of Afro-Celtic drums. Boston, you are one curious mix of Beacon Hill will and Mass Ave muscle. Dot Ave bustle and calm Ave moan. Washerwoman, student, and cab drivers hustle, singing your freshly minted immigrant songs inside of these days of giftedly drifting New England snow. So yeah, Boston, I dig you. Even though there are days you can be a pain in the back bay, I got to say, I big dig you. Big dig your artists and writers, musicians, designers, and these crazy poets like myself you keep on inviting and creating, like some seriously therapy-needing mother whose love both nurtures and smothers her children and others, even though all the while her heart, just like her dirty water, keeps breaking. Thank you.
Regie, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Regie Gibson, poet, Poetry Slam National Competition winner Regie Gibson right here with us. And do we have range? You seem to have a Brahmin-like need for power, this need to seethe and glower at the human race through a face wet with 17th century sweat. I dig you even though there are days you are a real pain in the back bay. Thank you, Regie. Thank you, Regie Gibson. Thank you very much. And now, before our final conversation, good long one I hope of the night, we have two more special performers with their own complex relationship with this city of ours. Born in New York, raised in Lexington, veteran of tours all over the world, and ubiquitous on Twitter, the lead singer, pianist, and songwriter of the Dresden Dolls comes to us tonight from Boston. She'll be performing a song she wrote especially for this occasion called Running Toward the Light. And then she has another special treat for us. She's brought along her husband, the author Neil Gaiman. He'll be reading for us a poem called Marathon, which Boston poet Nick Flynn wrote 1 year ago today. But first, please welcome Amanda Palmer.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. Thanks for having me. This is it's just been an amazing night so far. And listening to Jill talking about which way history is going to head, I couldn't help but hear a resonance. I have the same question. takes a lot of energy to actually hate somebody, doesn't it? And it takes a lot of nerve, they say, to wonder how it feels to feel the opposite. I saw my city locked up in a stricken scream. I saw displays of kinds of love I'd never seen. There's billions of souls out there and billions of ways that you could look at it. And there's terrorists and preachers of the art of sweet revenge and of exacting it. No matter who you're choosing to believe, we are all running the same marathon, it seems. But are we running towards the dark or towards the light? Who's on your side? Look to your left, look to your right. Do you see pain in every single other face? Congratulations, you have come to the right race. It takes a lot of faith to look around these days and not see just catastrophe. And they're telling us to stay inside and build our fortress higher than the enemy. But as the line outside the church of fear snakes on, there is another one 100 times as long. An eye for an eye, we'd rather be blind than to see our own brother so dark. And mile after mile we run in a circle, the compass arm's length from our hearts. It takes a lot of courage. After all, the world is really not expecting it. And there's heroes in the movies and the television, and they're standing next to it. You're in the squad car, the blackness of a cell. We're all just running up the same heartbreaking hell. But are we running towards the dark or towards the light? You're not alone, look to your left, look to your right. You're not alone and you have not been all this time. You have a human that can worn and tired to splint your broken ankles when you've lost your stride, to give you reasons to live when your child dies, to pull every single sorry one of us across the finish line. And we'll keep on running and 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 keep on running towards the light. It takes a lot of energy to actually love somebody, doesn't it? Thank you.
Amanda Palmer, thank you.
This is a poem called Marathon, written by Nick Flynn on the 15th of April, 2013. From above, petals on a river, a tree in blossom, one pink bud, unopened, falls and is carried downstream and out to sea. The other petals seem to carry it. Closer. This is our map. These are footprints. We grew up drinking this water. At the start, there was doubt. We lit a torch. No one believed we would make it. Closer. The legs, the heart, the lungs. It's too soon. to say we were lucky. It's too soon to say anything until the cloud is pulled back from the sky, until the ringing is pulled back from the bells. Look, everyone we've ever known runs without thinking, not away, but into the cloud where we are waiting.
Thank you. Neil Gaiman. Thank you, Neil. And Amanda Palmer, thank you very much. Amanda Palmer with Running Toward the Light. Neil Gaiman, their reading marathon by Boston poet Nick Flynn. It's too soon to say anything, we heard in that poem. Tonight, we're live from the John F. Kennedy Library with a special event observing, reflecting on the one-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings. And perhaps after 1 year, it's not too soon to say anything. We feel great fortune to be with all of you tonight and with this whole community gathered today. We've talked this evening, we looked back. I want to move forward, further forward together now to reflect on the reverberations of that strange day in all of our lives, that initial stunning shock followed by the surreal experience of a manhunt, a lockdown, a shootout in our own backyards, all that slowly, inevitably giving way to, well, what? Something more like normal life, perhaps, but still maybe not normal in the way it was before. To talk about that evolution over this last year, over the weeks and months and years ahead, three wonderful writers, thinkers, Boston minds join us now on the dais here at the Kennedy Library. First, the longtime Globe op-ed columnist, award-winning author of Mortal Friends, Requiem, Constantine's Sword, and many more, one of the great moral thinkers of our time and our city, James Carroll. James, thanks for being with us. With James Carroll on stage, his Globe colleague, co-author of the new book, Long Mile Home, Boston Under Attack, the city's courageous response and the epic hunt for justice, and as of yesterday, Pulitzer Prize winner, along with the rest of the Boston Globe team, Scott Hellman joins us. And finally, one of the funniest, serious people I know, or maybe one of the most serious, funny people, well known by his animated persona, Dr. Katz, professional therapist, but with us here tonight in person, Jonathan Katz. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you. Thank you. James Carroll, how has the day that we're remembering tonight, that all of Boston and much of the country has been remembering today, how has it begun to mature in your mind's eye, in your thinking, your emotions over these 12 months?
Well, Tom, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this important and poignant memorial. And I join everyone in thinking especially of the people who are still suffering and who've lost their lives. For me, I have to say that April 15th was part one of the story that didn't really come to a conclusion until April 19th. And I'm not thinking so much now just of the confrontation with the perpetrators that night, but with the what to me is one of the most important aspects of this whole experience, which was the profound, common experience we, a million of us, had together that Friday, the so-called sheltering in, when we were summoned by government authorities to, not ordered, that we couldn't be coerced, we couldn't be compelled, but we were summoned, we were called, we were asked to stay home. And the whole city did. And that event coming 3-4 days after the trauma of Marathon Day, in a way capped it. Because for one thing, we were forced to be quiet, to be with our loved ones, to be alone, to be without words, to be without activity, an extremely rare experience in our frantic culture. And we were suddenly invited to stop being bystanders to this drama, and in a very important way, as the police and government officials told us, we became active participants in it, because our being sheltered in gave the authorities the room and leeway they needed to do what they did that day and night. And by the time that night was over, we, the whole city, had experienced, I believe, certainly speaking for myself, an entirely new dimension of the Commonwealth. I mean, the Commonwealth, what folks have been talking about all evening, became palpable in a new way. We were forced to actually take it in and stop being bystanders to this tragedy and become participants in it.
And to take it in communally and feel that we were all sheltering in place.
We were alone together. And the togetherness is what I think we were left with, which is what, and then of course, there was an almost ecstatic explosion of celebration the next day with the Red Sox, which was the communal last word of that traumatic week. And Big Papi and the gathering at Fenway and the triumph of the team, a triumph, of course, that for those of us who know the history understand that this energy, drama, power generated actually the whole Red Sox season. So that by the time the World Series came around, it was for us, Bostonians, part of the same saga.
Part of a matrix. But we read you in the Boston Globe, James Carroll, and if I recall correctly, you expressed misgivings about that sheltering in place, that lockdown, that readiness to put security concerns above civil rights. We weren't ordered, but we were summoned. And you expressed some misgivings, as I recall, about our readiness to say, all right, we'll all talk it out.
Well, shall we put your memory against mine here?
No, no.
I know if that's the contest, I lose, but
no, you win. But
it's true that I've sometimes written things that I realized afterwards I didn't really mean, but
I thought you said
but I didn't write that. No, I didn't write that. I'm sure.
I thought you said that the public acceptance of that somehow made it easier to put aside issues like Guantanamo and even Edward Snowden's revelations later.
Yes, well, what I was suggesting was the public acceptance of the experience in Boston transcended our usual concerns. I regarded at the time, and never had a second thought about it, the public acceptance, my own included, of the call to shelter in as a profoundly important act of, let's call it, patriotism. And whatever, we can all have critical responses after the fact, and my skepticism toward the overreaching government is unabated, but that's part of what made this such an important moment. Governor Patrick, in a particular way, went way out on a limb by ordering the sheltering in.
Yes, he did.
Because if the events hadn't turned out the way they did, there would have been a lot of second guessing it. But in fact, I believe it was an inspired decision on his part. And as Commissioner Davis and other officials made very clear, it was what they needed to sort through what the mass of confusing elements that were defining that climactic day.
Jonathan Katz, what face or faces of Boston stick with, a year later, a mind like yours from that day?
Well, let me just respond for 1 second to what Jim was saying about the shelter in place, because some people like myself overreacted. I was home with my wife and my daughter, and I locked them in a cedar closet for 2 hours.
We hope they're well.
Oh, they're good now, but
no moths on them.
No, but do you mind repeating the question?
Well, no, let's just savor that image for a minute.
Yeah, okay.
It was strange to be behind those doors. Do you remember what you were thinking on that day as we all, basically everybody said, okay, we'll shelter in place then?
Yeah, but I have a daughter who goes to college on that block. And oddly enough, even though she comes home with her laundry once in a while, she chose to spend the night before at her home in Newton. And it was just a wonderful coincidence because she lived right in the corner where all that stuff happened.
Yeah.
But
I know your place in Newton. It's what, a mile from the Marathon Path?
yeah, yeah.
You must have watched it as I have with my family many times over the years.
Right. But when I moved to Newton, this is years ago, with my wife, my first week in Newton, my father-in-law, the late Lou Cates, said to me, Jonathan, if you're going to live in Boston, you need to know two things. You have to learn how to love the Red Sox. And 95 is 128. And I try and live by those rules.
Scott Hellman, you've reported so wonderfully on this. All of the Globe has, and congratulations again on the Pulitzer Prize. Yes. We celebrate deeply but quietly with you because, of course, all that reporting was on an awful lot of pain and suffering and something we all wish had never happened. Yeah, you've watched so closely, and I wonder how you have seen the city's sense of what happened a year ago evolve over these 12 months.
We've talked a lot tonight already, I think, about the sense of commonality that came out of this. And I think in a way, I mean, obviously none of us would ever ask for this to happen, but it's like we didn't know we wanted something like this to bring us together, in a sense. And I think that's true from the first moments the bombs went off. And I think of all these wonderful ways in which, you know, we lack, I think now, not to get too deep here, but, you know, we're very fragmented in what we watch on TV and our politics and our sports and our interests, right? Everything is a niche. And I was really struck on that night that we're talking about, that incredible sense of relief when the whole thing is finally over, that it was this universal moment in Boston, almost universal, with one important exception. But that rarely you would have that kind of thing, that everybody was following, because even Red Sox, I mean, I take your point about it being a lesson of living in Boston, but not everybody here cares about the World Series, right? That's the kind of maybe the closest we've gotten. But that night felt like unlike anything else we've ever had here, in the sense that everybody was sort of feeling the same way, in a sense. And I think that desire for commonality, I mean, we see it even, I mean, a couple weeks ago today, many of you saw what we did on the front page of the Globe today. We wrapped the paper in this gorgeous photo. We asked everybody to come to the finish line, and it's this beautiful photograph of first responders and survivors and anyone who was sort of affected. And we asked them to come at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning a couple of Sundays ago. Yes. Not a great time. And we assured everybody, look, we know this is a pain, but it'll be worth it. Please come. It'll be a beautiful thing. But it'll only take a few minutes, you know, and then you can go on about your day. And I was there, and I was really struck by how nobody wanted to leave. At that moment,
having gathered
minutes
early
on a
went
Sunday
on,
morning. 10 minutes, 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes. Everybody, the street was closed. We're all on Boylston Street. Nobody wanted to leave. And I think everyone really cherished that opportunity to just be together. And I'm talking about the Watertown police chief and Celeste Corcoran and, you know, the runner who was hurt and people like Alicia who were helping people. I mean, just everybody wanted to be together. And I think that, to me, has become the story here in many ways. And that, I think, is something we can see so clearly now that we couldn't a year ago.
But how does that stand up, that what you can feel is being celebrated as a kind of beloved sense of community, stand up against all the very real suffering and loss? I mean, family members, a child, limbs, that's still there. And so many people are grappling with that every day still.
No question, and I don't mean at all to say that somehow this has turned into some great story. It hasn't, of course not. But I mean, even today at the tribute event, you heard survivor after survivor talk very movingly about what all this support has meant, and that felt very genuine to me. Not just like I have to give a shout out to the One Fund, but this has really mattered. And I think it was it Patrick Downs? I think the newlywed he lost a leg, and his new wife had also lost a leg, and he said, "I hope, none of you ever have to go through what I've gone through, but I hope all of you can experience the love and sense of community that I have felt." So it certainly doesn't take away or negate or wipe away that suffering, but it is, as we talked about with Jill, it's how you remember, and I think that's one of the beautiful ways that we'll remember this.
Jonathan, how do you hold in your mind or look at that, the horror of that suffering and loss, and the beauty of that community that we've seen at the same time?
Well, I live in the town of Newton on the outskirts of Boston, and if you live in Newton, you live with the constant fear that someday somebody will break into your home and install a deck. But having said that, no, there was, the fear was palpable. It sort of defies imagination. Certainly mine at this moment. But can you repeat the question, Tom? I'm sorry. I'm such a bad listener.
You're a wise guy by profession.
Yeah.
Did you feel like you had to put a cork in it for a few days? Is that possible for
certainly.
you?
Oh my
for a
God.
longer time than that?
The cork is still there.
It must be a terrible sensation.
Yeah, that's a bad image. But no, I make my living making people laugh, and it's an odd position to be in, because it's a wonderful gift to be able to do that, but doesn't quite jive with the horrific events of that day.
In time, we open up. Jim, the Vice President today spoke in tribute here, and very robustly, and his big kind of applause line was along the lines of, they tried to cow us, but we don't change. We don't bend. Is that what you take from this year?
I have just incredible respect and affection for Vice President Biden. It's not a note that rings true to me. I think that the most important experience that we've all been talking about is the opposite of the military impulse that led to this violence in the first place. The Commonwealth experience, the experience of community, of social cohesion that immediately came together and reclaimed itself after the violence. And that to me is the strongest thing about not just the American story actually, but the marathon story, because after all, this whole thing commemorates an event in 490 when a runner comes back from Marathon with the news to Athens that the Persian Empire has been defeated. And that victory gave Athens, finally, what it needed to step back from military power as a defining note. And the Marathon was the beginning of the golden age of Athens, which was not about brute force. It was about common tenderness. It was about nurturing the imagination. It was in those decades after the Marathon that Sophocles taught us the lesson that Boston's been teaching us, which is that tragedy looked at directly and acknowledged and reckoned with in common ennobles us. It doesn't weaken us. But that's an ennobling and a strength that is not about our power to strike back. It's not about our power to hurt someone. What we did was take hurt, especially those people who literally were hurt.
Yes.
But we were all hurt with them. But what is unleashed in us is not the will to hurt. And when we talk about this event, that strikes me as the most important note to strike. Not, we will hurt you.
Yeah.
That's not the note. The note to strike is, as human beings, having been hurt, we see more than ever how important it is to live another way. And we will.
Scott, you've reported so much. I mean, I saw that. I think we all did. There was definitely anger, but in the manifest response, there was a kind of firm, steady, almost gentleness, even though there was lockdown and there was shootout, but the community-wide. Did you see that? I mean, Boston did not turn on its Muslim population. It did not go on a rampage. What did you see over these months in the community's response?
I would go back to that Friday night, and I think this is instructive here. The moment that, there's this very tense moment, in some ways the most tense moment of the week for law enforcement, is you've got the younger suspect, Jahar Tsarnaev. He's on the boat in Watertown. We've all seen the pictures. And they're going up to approach him, the SWAT team, and they don't know what he has at this point. They don't know if he's armed, if he has a suicide vest, if he's going to blow up. They don't know, right? And they can't
And given how violent this whole saga has been to that point, they had to assume it could continue in that vein.
Exactly, that is all they know. And they're approaching him, and they cannot see his right hand and his right leg. They're beneath
the
the
thermal
boat.
images you're talking about?
Even after that, when he is on the edge of the boat, they cannot see his right
still in the boat.
foot, his right leg, and they don't know what is attached to those things. And it's this very tense moment when finally he brings them up, they see he's unarmed, they yank him off the boat, right? From the minute that they tackle him on the ground, they look in his hands, make sure he doesn't have a detonator, they make sure he doesn't have a belt of some kind. And then in an instant, their objective turns to saving his life. In an instant.
Yeah.
They drag him away from the boat. The Army medic, the ATF medics come rushing over. The Boston EMS comes rushing over. And Governor Patrick told us that when he was, one of his state police details was there that night, and the detail told him any one of us would have gladly put a bullet in him, right? Especially after what had happened to Sean Collier that night. But he said that there wasn't a remark, there wasn't a look, there wasn't any kind of, manifestation of that anger or that desire to strike back among any of the law enforcement as he was brought to the ambulance. Jahar was brought to the ambulance. And I think, there are many moments like this, but that to me says more than anything about this is how we do things, this is how we're different, this is how we're going to respond to this. And I was really struck by that. And I think that goes to what Jim is saying about the appropriateness of the response. And we all might feel one way in our heart, but we know that we do things differently.
Do you think, Jim, that Boston is setting a different example for the country here? Was Boston's response to the marathon bombing a counter note to the country's 9/11 response?
I don't think it's proper to compare them at one level.
But you have.
We've learned,
You've noted that we went to war.
We've learned a lot in a decade.
Yes.
And we look back now on 9/11, and we understand, don't we, what a mistake it was for the President of the United States to stand on that rubble and turn that rubble into a stage declaring vengeance, lifting his fist and saying, "You will hear from us." We all understood at the moment, there was very few of us understood at the moment what was wrong with that. But it led quickly to a set of decisions, public decisions, almost all powerfully supported by the American people, unanimously supported by politicians. Public decisions that in hindsight we recognize were terrible mistakes. This is not to sit on the moral high horse and judge those decisions, because we were all part of that moment. But we made terrible mistakes out of the hurt we had taken and out of the fear it generated in us. And 2,000, 3,000 people is a lot of people too. It's not the hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed in other wars. Maybe in Boston, it isn't that Boston is better, God knows. No, it isn't. It isn't that we're morally attuned in a way that others aren't. It is, though, that we've been through a decade of understanding that irrational strike back makes things worse, not better. And I think we had internalized that. If what happened in Boston had happened in New York, Brooklyn, Milwaukee, Dallas a year ago, I would imagine a very similar set of responses. Americans have learned something in a decade. If we haven't, we're in worse trouble than we think we are.
I wonder how you think about that response as opposed to the 9/11 response, Jonathan. I mean, is it a difference of city, a difference of number? There were thousands in New York. There were 3 dead on that first day, 4 by the end of the week here. Is it a difference of maturation?
No, Tom, you know, I have such a oddly skewed view of the world. And I live in Newton, Massachusetts, which on a really scary day, somebody will break into your home and install a deck.
You mean a deck, like in the back?
Yeah,
in the back porch, backyard.
But
this is not an earth-shaking concern.
No. But
I would welcome a deck.
Yeah.
A nice deck.
But I also remember the headline in the Boston Globe the day, not so long ago, that read, "Berlin Wall collapses as Red Sox sweep Braves." Some of this stuff is funnier than it seems. I apologize. I'm working too hard. But
Jim, I wonder, let's go back to Joe Biden. Did he miss something today when he said that?
I didn't hear the whole speech. I did hear that excerpted, and the tone of it struck me as off, frankly.
To be fair, he said we don't bend to fear.
Well, that's true.
Well, we have historically I mean, after 9/11, there was a lot of fear in the air, but maybe it's the maturation that you're talking about of this decade. But I wonder if a certain bending, a certain flexibility is not, in a broader sense, isn't something we've learned to be open to rather than intuitively rejecting.
Well, let's step aside from the vice president for a minute and just say the question really is, thinking twice about our feelings also, what rhetorical response to a critical public moment is likely to make things better, not worse? That's in a way the question. And the easiest rhetorical response to make at a difficult moment is to cast the problem abroad. That's the problem out there, and we will not be defeated by it. And one of the things that moved me so powerfully about the experience a year ago is that even though we were desperate to identify and capture the perpetrators, there was a way, in part for me, I think it was related to the sheltering in experience, there was a way in which we were invited to a moment of introspection. We did actually, as a people, as a city, as a commonwealth, reckon very powerfully with the preciousness of our public servants. We understood in a fresh way the nobility of these folks who run toward, in Kevin Cullen's phrase.
Yes, the bombs.
Yes, and there were any number of those experiences that were larger than identifying the source of our anxiety as out there and resolving to demonize it and fight it. Now,
of course, we didn't know what it was at that moment of running toward the bomb. It was just violence. It was 2 explosions.
Right, and the people on the scene that day are having a very different experience than the one I'm talking about, having in mind the whole arc of the week.
Yes.
because by the time of sheltering in, we are not, most of us, people in Watertown certainly had serious reason to feel threatened, but most of us understood that we were not in the realm of threat, although there were rumors and signals of trouble all over town. You may remember that day, but
Yeah.
And at the time itself, one of the moving things about what the first responders have said to us tonight and other times is the way in which that first response was not at all about who did this and we'll get them. It was about who needs help now and how can we get them the help they need. So what am I saying? I'm saying that again and again and again that week, there were these moments of human largeness. It was a privilege for Boston to have such moments. And those are the moments that need to be celebrated and lifted up in memory. And those are the moments that are being lifted up in memory. That's what happened in the way the Globe has told the story from the beginning.
Yes.
That's what happened with events today. And that's, I'm sure, what happened with the overwhelming weight of Vice President Biden's remarks today. But to lift up and celebrate human largeness and keep the will to oppose in context is
Yes.
all I'm really saying.
Scott, what surprised you about the city's response? What has surprised you in the immediate days after, over the course of this year? Did you see Boston responding in character as you know it? Did you see something unexpected in some angle or facet degree?
I think it responded as I would expect. I mean, we all want to believe that we're that person that runs toward the smoke. Many of us were. I'd like to think I would do the same thing if I were there. I don't know. I mean, you know, a lot has been made about the phrase Boston Strong, which became a very useful sort of distillation of this, you know, constellations of feelings, but it became a very easy thing to articulate. And a lot has been said about what it means and how appropriate it is. And I mean, there are two things I think about in regards to that phrase. I mean, one, I sort of see it, and this was affirmed today, I see it more as almost as an instruction or as an aspiration that it's up to us to be strong for the people who need us to be strong. You know, let's help Jane Richard. Let's pray for the family of Crystal Campbell and all the others. Let's use that as our blueprint almost, not sort of what we are, but what we can be and what we can do. And then I think it's also important to not lose sight of the fact that there are people for whom that very phrase, Boston Strong, is difficult because it somehow makes them feel inadequate if they're not feeling fully strong. There was a great quote in the Globe this morning from a woman who said, a photographer who was really struggling with this a year later emotionally. And she said something to the effect of, you know, in the year of Boston Strong, I've never felt more weak. And so I think one of the things that we need to remember, and I think we will see this as this anniversary passes, is to let those people who are really still struggling with this, particularly the emotional wounds that we can't see, give them the space to feel okay about not feeling Boston Strong and include them in that message.
There's a kind of openness to that frailty that we also feel. I was struck, I mean, you can interpret that phrase in so many ways, but I was struck by how it wasn't just a strength of brutality or smashing back. There was a kind of strength in equanimity, a kind of strength in steadiness that I think you've described, Jim, and we could feel in those days afterward. Not perfect, but palpable. In the reporting the Globe has done in so much detail on those who suffered and those who took losses, what about their trail over this year? How you see them doing? You may have particular people that come to mind, Scott. You know, we've seen them dance. We've seen them on the diamond in Fenway. But it's not all perfect recovery and perfect therapeutic, you know, excellence.
So one of the women that we follow in our book is a woman from Rhode Island whose name is familiar to a lot of people. Her name is Heather Abbott. She was a spectator outside of Forum and ended up having her
restaurant.
the restaurant in Boylston, right in front of the second explosion, ended up having her leg amputated. And she's made tremendous progress. I mean, just her strength and her spirit have been amazing. And I mean, she's up on a paddleboard, she's going back to work, she's up on the blade running. I mean, it's remarkable. But in telling us her story, you know, there are these moments that were kind of reminders to her, even as she was making this progress. And one of them really stuck with us. So she lives in Newport, Rhode Island, and she had, you know, been in the hospital. She'd been in Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital, like a lot of these survivors, and she'd finally gone home. I think it was in May, after throwing out the first pitch of the Red Sox game, and she gets home to her apartment. And this is a woman who, you know, really loves going out, loves dressing up. She loves wearing shoes. You know, this is important to her. It's part of her identity. And she gets back to her apartment, and she had forgotten that before the bombing, she had ordered all these sundresses and shoes. Mm-hmm. And they are in her apartment waiting for her when she arrives back home without
How long
her
is
left
this
leg.
after
This
the
is
15?
6 weeks, I'm going to say. I don't remember exactly. And a friend or a family member had brought them in. And so, and she's doing great. You know, she's making this progress, and then she's face to face with the reality of all that has changed. And, she, you know, she loses it. I mean, she starts crying. It's a really tough thing to see. And so that's sort of been my experience in talking to some of these people that, you know, sort of 3 steps forward, and then kind of this reminder that things are different. And then you kind of steel yourself for the next thing, and then there's another little reminder. But I think by and large, I mean, Adrian's dancing again. Jane Richard is doing Irish step dancing. You know, Heather is up on a paddleboard running. I think we'll probably see 1 or 2 of the survivors run at least a part of the marathon next week. I mean, it's incredible how much progress they've made collectively and individually.
Mayor Menino, former Mayor Menino, was moving today in his vow to survivors that when the lights go off and the hoopla, the celebrations and observances have passed, they will not be forgotten. Do you feel confident in that, James Carroll?
I think that all of what we're talking about will turn out to have been hollow if it's not true. If the people who themselves have been most impacted, wounded, bereaved by this experience, if they find their hurt, forgotten, left behind, that will be a betrayal of the meaning of this whole event. It's curious that it's moving to me that you lift up Mayor Menino as an emblem of that will, because one of the things that was so clear through this experience is that Mayor Menino himself embodied this determination in those days to care for one another, to put the needs of others ahead of one's own needs. His really brave coming out of the hospital the way he did.
Yes.
His palpable weakness. He really was physically not up to the things that were demanded of him, very clear. And yet, there was a way in which he was essential to the city's response, I believe. And I think that it was a kind of magnificent climax to his time as mayor. And that's the note that I'm so grateful was struck at the ceremonies at the Heinz today. And it's not a surprise to me that it was Mayor Menino who struck it.
Could we turn to the Sarnaya brothers for a moment? Jill Lepore, at the beginning of our evening tonight, raised the question of how these events will be seen over time, and that there's a question of whether what happened in Boston at the marathon bombing will be seen in the line of descent from 9/11 and the London bombings and the Madrid bombings, Al-Qaeda and Islamic radicalism, or if over time it may be seen as part of the fabric that contains Newtown and Aurora, Colorado, and Tucson and Virginia Tech, and maybe going even back further, Columbine. What do you think about that question?
Well, especially when it's put in a litany like this, the violence that that's been inflicted on the commonweal, the soul of this country over these years, the thing it has in common is all of it's absurd. It's all absurd violence, whether it's coming from, whether it's whether it's coming from adolescent boys, in Jill Lepore's phrase, or politically motivated terrorists, or pure nihilists, or the anti-Semite hater in Kansas
Yes,
2
Kansas
days ago.
City, yes.
Wherever this is coming from. And the most important thing for me is that I am part of where it's coming from. I'm not just a victim of this. These are human beings acting out of human experiences that somehow none of us can claim absolute distance from. Every monster is someone to whom something monstrous has been done. Yates?
Yes.
These are monsters. Something monstrous was done to these people. It's just a call, all of it. It's a call to us to think hard about our lives and about how we live together and what's going on in our schools, what's going on in our prisons. What is going on in our prisons? What is going on, in our nation? The enemy is not out there, and the enemy isn't within either. We don't need to define the problem in terms of enemies. The more we claim it, the more we own it, the more we understand those troubled adolescent boys who are behind so much of this horrible violence, the more we claim them as sons and brothers and fathers, and require them to participate humanely in this commonwealth with us, which of course itself goes to our problem, because the word commonwealth itself gets more and more absurd, doesn't it, in a society where the wealth isn't common, less and less common. It isn't just the young nihilist boys who've lost a sense of moral responsibility, it's the owners of this country who also have lost a sense of moral responsibility for the whole. It's a stretch, I know, but we are all in this together. That's the good news we celebrate from that week last year. But we're all in this together, responsible for these absurd acts too, somehow.
James Carroll. This story doesn't end. I've just been handed a news report from the Associated Press, and let me read. The dateline is Our City, Boston. Police say they've taken a man into custody in connection with 2 unattended backpacks found at the Boston Marathon finish line. This is today. Police spokesman Dave Estrada says the backpacks were discovered Tuesday evening. A year after 2 bombs and backpacks exploded at the end of the marathon and killed 3 people. The bomb squad is checking the backpacks. Police have cleared the area. This is now. Trains are bypassing the nearby Copley Square station. The police department has tweeted asking people to avoid the area. Let's hope this is nothing. Let's hope this is just a very strange coincidence. But what about this city's sense of its own security going forward, Scott? I mean, we're going to have a marathon next week with very different security measures that we've seen in the past. Has our response to what happened a year ago bought us some freedom from those concerns, or are we locking into a different matrix of security expectations going forward?
I mean, this is where I do think Boston is not different than any other city. I mean, I think...
Scott, can I cut you off for 1 second? Tom, do you like Scott more than me? I'm sorry. I was selfish and childish.
I adore you.
Okay,
Jonathan.
I apologize.
I don't know. I mean, I'm going to hope that what you're reading there is not something nefarious. But I mean, look, one of the things that the bombing did was expose our vulnerability, and in some ways, every city's vulnerability. And it's not, it's not like this is, after 9/11, every big public event, you built in this preparations for this kind of thing, right? I mean, before last year's marathon, they were sweeping the finish line with bomb-sniffing dogs, right? They have cops everywhere, undercover. I mean, it's not like there wasn't security. There was pretty heavy security, and this has been protocol for years. But the reality is, can you stop 2 ne'er-do-well brothers who walk in at the last minute and drop a backpack? I don't know. I don't know.
What about your sense of security, Jonathan, at home or out in the city these days?
It's shaky. It's really shaky. You know, I was lucky enough to meet with President Obama not so long ago, and we discussed a National Day of Compassion, which, you know, I'm way out of my league when talking to a guy like that. And he was excited about the idea, and I said, Tuesdays are not good for me. But, you know, I feel like such a lightweight here. I feel like a court jester. And I apologize that I can't quite rise to the gravity of the occasion. But
that's a very beautifully humble thing for you to say, Jonathan. And it's not true. It's not true.
Well, you know, I know there's a place for comedy, and this doesn't feel like it's it, you know? But
your acknowledgement of that is very helpful to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
It has been a year after all.
Yep.
What about those who are still struggling with their injuries from that time? Those who are learning to walk in new ways? How do you think about them, Jonathan?
That's something that I really means so much to me, because I'm a guy living with a disability. I have MS, right? And, you know, I feel like in some ways I'm the luckiest guy in the world, but it's not like it was inflicted on me from
a bomb.
A bomb, right? I do my own bombing in nightclubs.
Yeah.
But it's powerful stuff. My big problem is I can't hang on to a thought for more than 30 seconds.
We've got a year here.
Yeah.
James, how do you think this city will look back on April 15th, 2013? Will it stand over decades as a date that's remembered? Does it gradually fade next to the Boston Massacre and the other sort of great cliffs of Boston history?
Well, we're lucky because it's tied to this magnificent and peculiarly Boston holiday, which is a holiday that lends itself to reflection. And I'm old enough and long enough in Boston to really have a palpable sense of how this city has become ever more humane, ever more beautiful, ever more belonging to all the people. It's been happening palpably in Boston for 30 or 40 years. And I hope we look back on this horrible event and the complicated and in some way also noble things that were expressed in relationship to it. We look back on it sort of the way the people of Athens, we are the Athens of America, right? The way the people of Athens look back on their marathon, which was the beginning of a whole new and wholly unexpected, it called the Golden Age. And it's easy for me to imagine Boston on the threshold of a golden age. The city grows in its beauty and its humanity palpably every day, every month, every year. And I think that what we're remembering today is that this occasion, too, can be a place we mark as a time when, for all the horror of it, we got better.
That thought certainly tells us that it is some time since the tragedy of that day a year ago. It's a beautiful thought to close on with you tonight, and I think we will right there. James Carroll, Scott Hellman, Jonathan Katz, thank you very much, all three, for being with us. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, Scott, James. What a remarkable evening. A lot to think about, a lot to feel, and I hope a lot to sustain us all in the days and weeks ahead. Last April was a strange time in Boston. In a way, this April is a strange time, too. No longer raw, but nowhere near forgotten. The wounds and pains and sorrows we feel now are in some ways in that odd in-between time, that time when they are neither newly acquired nor yet fully healed. And of course, this week and next Monday when the racers will run again, brings so much back afresh. We are strong, all of us, but there were and are very real wounds here too. We don't want to forget, but neither do we want to live in the past. And so we live here tonight in this moment, together, I hope, and stronger. And I hope, thanks to the wonderful voices and spirits and songs of the people who have so generously shared their time with us here tonight. Before we close out this evening, I'd like to thank all of our guests through this evening: Ronald Feldman, Jill Lepore, Alicia Shambo, Sean O'Brien, Kevin Cullen, Bill Janovitz, Regie, Gibson, Amanda Palmer, Neil Gaiman, James Carroll, Scott Hellman, Jonathan Katz, and a very special thanks again to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum for offering us this wonderful space to come together in, to share our stories, to be here, to hear where we are. And finally tonight, I have one more guest to thank before she even appears, because I think we all know that she'll take us out of this wonderful evening on a wonderful wave of music. She's been described as riveting, hypnotic. She's known for her drop-dead brilliant work on guitar. She's won 11 Boston Music Awards, an honorary doctorate from the Berklee College of Music, where she's now an artist in residence. What she says about her music herself, though, is quite simple. What I want to walk away with and what I want to leave the listener with is a sense of hope. That seems especially appropriate tonight. It's my wish for all of you, wherever you're listening, here at the Kennedy Library or in the greater Boston community, thank you for joining us tonight, and please welcome, to close out our evening, the wonderful Patty Larkin.
I've been around, I've been up and down until I've been out of control with your world in motion. Gotta put a ball in a chain on your soul. All those angels running, picking up the pieces, putting back together hearts broke long ago. I know a good thing when I see it, and it's a bad thing to let go. Dreams like distant thunder, and I had hope like a prayer unheard. This is nothing less than perfect in a less than perfect world. All those angels running, picking up the pieces and putting back together hearts broke long ago. I know a good thing when I see it, and it's a bad thing to let go.
Patty Larkin, thank you for a beautiful song. Take us out of a beautiful evening. Have you got another for us, Patty?
I'll do a little Celtic-y instrumental.
We'll take it. Celtic-y instrumental, always welcome in our town, Boston.
Well, the Irish have a saying, it's can't dance, too wet to plow, too windy to haul rocks, might as well drink. So it's called Might As Well Dance. Thanks, Tom. Ooh, yeah. Well, cat got your tongue and the rent's rather late. A bad love affair's made a mess of things. Wolf's at the door and there's nothing on your plate. Standing there naked and the telephone rings. Ah, well, the boogeyman will get you while you're lying in your bed. Pull the pillow off your head. You might as well dance. Might as well dance. Ooh, yeah, might as well dance.
Hey! Thank you, dear Patty. Thank you. Thank you. Patty Larkin, thank you very much. We are off air. I thank you all so much for coming out tonight. What a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for spending it with us. Be safe. Go Boston.